So, University of the Underground, I guess some of you know what this is all about and some of you don't know.
It's a tuition-free.
Yes, it's a tuition-free university, which is based down below here, Marktkantine.
It's one of the oldest nightclubs in Europe.
Yes, but not the university.
No,
I think
it
you
used
get this
to be.
Right. You know, you are getting the good life because actually you are traveling a lot. Yes,
Don't be jealous.
And I'm staying in the basement.
You are.
But, you know, it's a duo. We work together, as you can see.
A lot.
But anyway, so University of the Underground, based in the basement. Basically, we have a master in design of experience, and some of our students here tonight will be sharing with you some of their experiments and some of the work they've done, you know, during this year. And it's a 2-year master program, but it's also a cultural institution. And tonight is one of our first public events. And so we will be, And so we will be investigating the act of thinking. And actually, this is something that, you know, our students are being tasked to consider a lot in the context of the institution. And so we wanted to share with you some of that learning that develops through the year with you. And so we are kind of putting together a whole program that is going to be looking at the at language, basically, at first. And then the other panel will be looking at celebration in the context of politics. Yes. Great. So that's it. I think we should probably roll up and actually start with our first panel, which will be talking about the act of thinking and specifically the fact of actually speaking and how language has got a key role to play in power structures. And so to start with, I guess we should speak a bit about Homo Faber.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Homo Faber speaks. So it's about language and the way language affects our society and politics. That is. So we have tonight Cyborg Ribas, who is a cyborg. Sorry for my very French accent. Cyborg. She's a cyborg lady. She used to have an implant in her elbow, but now it's in her foot, and she can feel the earthquake in her body. And that's how she performs and dances. So it means on stage, when she doesn't feel any earthquake, then the performance will be very quiet, which I think is fascinating.
Yes. Well, hopefully it's not going to be too quiet tonight.
No, it won't.
Do you want to join us on stage? And you came all the way from Catalan as well? From Barcelona? See?
Oh.
See? Welcome. Please have a seat with us. And for those of you as well that don't know what Homo Faber is, maybe we should explain it a bit, because some of you might not know about political philosopher Hannah Arendt, but our students here are getting their fair share of Hannah Arendt. And she's a political philosopher. She pretty much survived the entire Second World War. And basically, she defined the fact that institutions pretty much run on the fact that there is Homo Faber, the people who think, and there is animal laborants, the people who make. And she makes that kind of difference that the people who think actually are provided with the power of language. So we will ask you, Moon, what you think about language in your,
That's of course.
You know, as a trans-species human being or not human being, who knows. Anyway, let's keep going. So we have a Moon, but we have also a magician, here. We have Janse. Please join us, Janse. Where are you, Janse? No, he's not there.
Where is he?
Yeah, an amazing magician. Welcome. 15 countries.
15 countries, nearly as much as I did.
Dutch world champion of magic. And you're quite young actually, and you managed to do quite a lot. Huh? So you must be really, really talented. It must be down to your brain as well. I mean, we have like an amazing brain here.
Impressive.
We are going to speak about the brain as well, because tonight we also have Dr. Alexander Heimel,
who is a neurosociologist?
Biologist. Yes,
you need to say it in French.
Alexander Heimel. That's it. Welcome. And then
Professor Rachel Armstrong.
Yes, and she will be talking to us about experimental architecture. Welcome, Rachel.
Living
and we have some bacteria as well. Here we go. Thank you for joining us. And Rachel has got actually also a workshop. Don't forget as well the living program. We have some workshop going on all around the building. So please go and visit it. The university is in the basement, so you can visit it during the year. But for now, Rachel came and ran a workshop on Monster. And you will be telling us all about your experience of working with living structure in the context of architecture. And then finally, we
Ramon
have...
Amaro.
Ramon Amaro, yes, one of our teachers in the University of the Underground. Come on, Ramon. Welcome, welcome. Here we go. So, Ramon, you are Dr. Ramon Amaro. You're specialized in blank ontology, but also machine learning. And then finally, you've been also studying, you actually train as an engineer, then move into, philosophy, and then before that, sociology. So quite a unique background there as well.
And Joseph.
Yes, Joseph, go ahead.
Who does hypnosis.
Yes, here he is, Joseph. Where are you?
Joseph.
And you're also a coach. You're a coach, a therapist, and you will be taking care of us all night. You're going to be hypnosis. You can go under hypnosis all night as well. Exciting. I'm just wondering, actually, maybe we should turn you around. You know, it's a new experiment, but then I feel like if it's a bit sad for you to not watch the audience, this is going to be a bit of an odd experience, but let's do that. I mean, let's just turn around, see your audience. That's it. That's much better, isn't it? Much better. So anyway, you probably wonder what all of these people have to do with each other. And that's actually something also that is very much part of our program in the University of the Underground, where our students are very much like learning from politics, film, music, design, all of this at the same time, and sometimes it can be very confusing to them. And I'm sure they will tell you all about that. But we also believe in the value of actually mixing up viewpoints. And so in that context, I would love to start by actually asking you, Moon, to tell us a bit about your experience of speaking. Speaking and the role of language into your work.
Okay.
If any.
It's weird that you're asking me there. No, okay.
Yeah. You can, no, but you can look at me. You can look at the audience. Okay. We like to traumatize our speaker usually.
So I guess my own experience of language is, I guess what I try to think about is how we communicate to the outside world. So I guess my aim is to create new senses. Like through our senses, we experience the reality and the outside world. So if you create a new sense, your experience of reality changes. So I guess my own language would be this creation of new senses and how we communicate to the outside world and to reality. And that we can all design ourselves and decide how we want to perceive reality and communicate to the reality.
But maybe explain everyone here, what does it mean to be a transspecies to start with?
Okay, first so as Nelly said, I feel like I'm a cyborg because I have a couple of implants on my foot that allow me to feel the seismic activity of the planet in real time. And I see this as my artwork, I call this the seismic sense, the sense of feeling the seismic activity of the planet in real time. And I also feel that I identify myself as a trans species because I now feel that I have a new sense that is no longer defined as a human sense. So in the species society, we wondered, like there's many people that maybe we don't identify ourselves as 100% humans, that we can define ourselves in other ways. And I guess, we wonder about identity.
So, Alexander, you being the scientist in the room, I mean, how do you feel about transspecies?
Transspecies?
Yeah. Have you ever considered that? Because, I mean, you're working with rats, right?
Yeah, with mice. So
I remember when I spoke to you the first time on the phone, you really were like, I don't do human brains.
Exactly. So,
but
if you look at the brain...
But you know about the human brain, right?
They look very similar.
So you can speak about it a bit.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So I hear myself echo, but if it's fine for you. So if looking at the brain, it looks almost identical. So in a mouse, of course, I study a mouse brain. It's tiny. It's like a centimeter wide, and has much fewer neurons. But if you section it, then it almost looks like this. So it doesn't look so curved. But then it makes you realize how similar they are. And if you study the behavior of mice, then many things are very similar, and these underlying brain mechanisms are the same. But then, having said that, there's also very obvious differences, especially if you talk about language tonight. So that seems extremely different. So it's generated here in this part of the brain that mice also have, but it's very obvious that mice don't do language. They sing to each other, so actually men sing to the females when they're in need of sex, but and there's some communication, like pups, they have calls to call their moms, but in general it's nothing close to language. Like even monkeys, right? If I show you a monkey brain here, or if your artist would have made a monkey brain, it would have looked identical here. To me, there's obviously differences in a monkey brain, but in this sort of scale, it looks very similar. But there also language is absent. They can teach gorillas, right, a couple of words, 100 words, but it's nothing close to language. So in that sense, species are very different.
Tell us about the cell, because that's really what you study, right?
Like yes.
So the neurons, that's what is inside this gigantic brain there, right?
Exactly. So there are like 100 billion nerve cells in our brain, and so we try to see them. So in humans, we cannot see them, at least not in a living human. Or you're not volunteering to have neuroscientists like me looking at these neurons. But in mice, you can look at these individual neurons firing away, communicating. And then also a neuron, if I would show you a picture of a neuron in a mouse, it looks identical to the one in a human.
But tell us how do people think? Like, how does that work with the synapses? What is making that magic happen?
Yeah. But that's a good point. There's probably no magic, right? At least in neuroscience, our working hypothesis is that there's no magic. That really our thinking, our talking, our feeling is just neurons communicating with each other. And we're not sure of that, but so far we have no evidence that it's not the case, that we need something else. So, and what are neurons communicating? Basically, they are like excitable. They have excitable membranes, like they're cells, like any other cell in your liver, in your toe, but they're quite special in not that they're polarized, so they're negatively charged compared to the surroundings. But what they can do is they can spike. They can briefly become positive, and then if they have tentacles, they can give this positivity or this charge. They can touch somebody else, and you can touch her, and you can touch her, and in that sense, cells communicate. And somehow, because we have lots of different connections, and depending on who touches me, I touch them. This is what thinking is.
And so do you think that someone like Moon, for example, has got more connections than other, and she's more able to make different and more unique thoughts because she's got an implant?
She even has added connections, more inputs than normal people, than other people.
So you're quite excited when you meet someone like Moon, for example.
Well, yeah.
How do you showcase that excitement as a scientist? Like, what's you're like?
Well, yeah, I'm very curious in the end. So how do you perceive this? In the end, do you get this extra sense? Do you start integrating it, and do you start making it? Does it feel like part of yourself, or does it still feel like something is vibrating, and then you consciously have to think? Oh, you make the translation. There's a signal. Somebody turns on. It's tapping, right? So if I would tap you, it feels external. But
there's a process of integration always. When you add a new sense, first it's something outside, and then you adapt to it, and then it becomes part of you, and now it becomes part of my own identity, like having this extra input.
And so, Janse, what about you then? What do you think about this statement that there is nothing magical about our brain?
Yes, well.
I mean, you're I'm still coming back to it, but you're quite young, right? To be like 15 country, world leading, like you must be really talented. Do you think that your brain maybe might be a bit different than ours somehow?
Absolutely not. I think, like many professions, it's all coming down to repetition and experience. I was a magician when I started as a magician when I was about 6 years old, and it always stuck with me. Now I'm 30, so I had 24 years of practice. So if tonight you think, oh, that looks impossible, it's an accumulation of that kind of practice. But when I hear these panelists speak about information, I think the interesting thing about magic is that, well, it's entertainment, that's based on deception. And deception is like a mistransmission of information. What I want, what I desire as a magician, is that you miss some clues in my language, in my handling. And if you miss these, you will come to an emotional conclusion that what you witnessed is magical or impossible. So in that sense, if you talk about neurons are not magical, for me, I live in the same reality. Nothing, if I see colleague perform magic, nothing is magical for me. That's a
bit sad. I'm sure that, Rachel, you're going to pick this up. Right, this man is obviously having a problem with magic. And I remember you telling the student about abracadabra and the meaning of what abracadabra is, actually. Is this happening? Can we do some magic on that?
That was just brute strength. So yes, abracadabra was one of the things that we were talking about in the workshop, which is I create what I see. And for me,
this is what he means, right? I had no idea that actually abracadabra means
you are conjuring,
that word means that.
You're actually conjuring something into existence, something into language, something to be considered, to be entertained, to be interrogated, to be experimented with, the beginning of experience. Let's see. So the work that I work with is really about what happens when stuff that is not alive makes a transition towards the living. And within that process, this matter starts to have a conversation with itself. And I think that we focus very much on the rational brain to create the languages through which we already privilege and prioritize certain kinds of experiences. So, for example, your cyborg experience, you're learning to privilege information coming into your body. There's a great deal of redundancy in the brain so that we don't shout about everything that's happening to us. But that we have codes and selective ways of filtering the world so that we start to build conversation and society. So I just kind of want to, touch into the space of the non-human. Mention Myra Hurd's really excellent book about the origins of sociable life, which she attributes to the first biofilms, in other words, microbial colonies that learn to coexist, build structures together. So they have to have a kind of conversation and a kind of language that gives them an emergent property through which that they can persist and thrive in a particular space. So beyond unicellular singularity becomes multicellularity, in which these structures of society, like language, start to emerge. So how do we start to think about that when we think about materials, designing and engineering with materials? Can we think about the many different kinds of languages, many of which we either have no rational access to, or we choose to ignore in some ways? I'm going to park that for a second because what I want to talk about is the second brain. I wouldn't say it was the least important of our brains, but I would like to talk about the gut, because the gut is a second space in the body, or it's in fact really not an interior space. It's actually connected to the exterior. But within that space, you've got a whole bunch of nerves and vessels that have a different thinking process to the one that we normally attribute to the rational brain. And the way I would differentiate between them is that the gut brain is a brain of immediate experience. There's no future. The thinking brain, it's prioritizing the senses that deal with distance and the future. So vision is something that is not right up against your skin. It's not at the boundary of an organism. It's somewhere in the distance. Therefore, we start to see it as being something that can negotiate the future. language and sound are also virtual experiences. They are vibrations, coming from elsewhere that are giving us information. But the gut loves the stuff that is interior and precious to us. And not only that, it has a fantastic conversation with non-humans. In other words, our microbiome, the world of microorganisms that we grow up with, that we share in family households, that change our moods, that digest our food for us, that oil up our skin, as a kind of second brain and endocrine system. And I guess I just want to draw attention to that because that whole thinking and language is weird. And we have kind of normalized and as we need to as a society. But I guess we prejudice ourselves against things that we haven't attributed great value to. So in other words, my work is about trying to open up that conversation.
And so perhaps actually that brain shouldn't be a brain, it should be a giant bacteria or a conglomerate of bacteria.
It's the multi-species thing that you're thinking. I think the idea that any being is pure, I think, is a ridiculous notion. Life is a trans system.
And then also the system can, develop thought and thought process. And I guess, Ramon, maybe you want to tell us a bit about your work and specifically machine and machine learning, because in the case of machine, there is not so much living organism in a machine. So how does that apply? How does a machine learn? And, what is your kind of learning curve working with machines and discussing with machines and the people who make these machines? Triple question there.
The first thing that's important for me to distinguish is the functional operation of language and communication and this sort of extrasensory type of communication that we're concerned with. On one hand, we have, this very functional type of process where we can look at the communication between neurons. We can actually measure the distance between the type of excitation. We can look at the interconnections and these networks that are developed within this certain membrane or closed system or apparatus. But the important thing, the thing that's sort of fundamental to my research is that language exists prior to our conception of being. Language is something that takes on a transcendence and a normality to assist us with attaching meaning to the phenomenon that we recognize. So that's what allows us to actually call it communication. Because when we look at the biological level, we can measure the fact that there's a communication between synapses, but we don't know why they excite the way that they excite. We don't know why that they have the network of communications that they have. And what we're actually forced to do is create an initial starting point which already lives within the language that we understand to try to measure that. And the implications of that process is we're already reducing a portion of life to an initial point of hypothesis even prior to understanding what is happening in the brain or what is happening in forms of communication. And why this is essential to me is because there's a difference between the functional operation of our bodies and how it works, and this disjointedness between that operation and what I call the live experience of the body itself. I think that puts us, in a sense, into a certain type of crisis. Because we know things function on a certain level, but we also know we have lived experience. We are not mice and men, right? We have these sort of effectual relationships with the environment, with ourselves, with nature. We have these sort of interconnections that cannot be reduced to the excitation of a neuron. And that is the portion that we don't understand, and perhaps we don't want to understand. And in terms of my research, a lot of the violences, a lot of the discriminations, a lot of the disparities in society come from attempts to try to reduce and understand those relationships, as opposed to letting those relationships happen organically to create new forms of relations. So for instance, this implant of the type of cybernetic device is actually catalyzing new forms of relationships that supersede any understanding of any prior relationship that's there. So in terms of machine learning, of course, the most seamless analogy in terms of this discussion would be a neural network or generative neural network, which originally was modeled after the sort of communications within the brain. It's diverted from that now. But within that, we're still living within the language that our sensory, our modes of sensory perception can be quantified, they can be defined if we're given enough output to make that happen. And we know from the disparities in our life that that's almost an impossibility. And I'm sort of curious if we shift the mode of communication from understanding our environment, our relationship to the environment, from an initial hypothesis, and shift that hypothesis to a purely generative space where the actual contact in the relationship becomes the most important. And I'm curious, if we make that type of shift, what possibilities we can have as culture, as people, and even as rats.
Perhaps this shift could happen with you, right? You could make that shift happen for us? What is that? It doesn't work out. There you go. That's it.
Okay.
So that shift could happen maybe perhaps with hypnotherapy? Do we think that would be the missing input that can kind of drive us to, developing a new form of organic thinking?
Well, I like what he's saying, and I think that when I look
Well, that's good.
When I look at language, I'm in agreement. Better said, I'm in agreement. When I look at language, I think that language in the form of words, language, universal grammar language, is a highly limiting form of communication. And with language, we only communicate about 10, 15% of what we can. And there's an argument. Everybody familiar with universal grammar theory? Yes? No? No.
We have no idea.
Universal grammar is the theory that only humans, which is pretty much verified, have language, and it's a genetic mutation that took place about 50,000, 100,000 years ago, which gave the human species the ability to understand conceptually what language is. But I think that language is highly limited, and it deprives the human species of communications. I tend to talk with my hands. Communications that are possible on many other levels, on sensory levels, on neuroconnective levels, on the levels of waves of energies transmitting between humans and humans and humans and other species. So language is very potent in the world we live in. I'm very much involved with language as influence. So I think I would argue that everyone who's here tonight is here because somehow they have been influenced to be here. Okay? Fake news, politics.
Fake news, you're for real.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I think language is a devolutionary limitation.
But then how do you get people under hypnosis if it's not using language? Because let's just remember, because people don't know you. So maybe you want to introduce yourself a tiny bit?
Yes.
So what is your job, basically? You put people under hypnosis,
I
is that
try
correct?
to get people to
Through
go
language?
deeper into themselves. Language is a tool for getting there. So I try to influence people to go deep into themselves, try to scrape in a sensory manner their experience, their learning, their self-knowledge, and to operate on that level and to manifest it into an expression of who you are.
So then let's move to the second phase of that conversation, which is actually about dangerous thoughts.
Dangerous thoughts.
Yes, and where they are being formulated. Because I mean, if you're influencing people through, of course, the use of language, then how, are you not yourself, like, to some extent, dangerously influencing our mode of thinking and what,
I tend to see
and the
myself
actions
as,
that we might
in
develop
language,
out
a
of
little
it?
bit more sensitive and sophisticated. I think language dangers, look at marketing, look at fake news, look at politics. These are dangerous uses. That's the abuse of language. That's manipulation, influence, control. Okay?
And you are not influence control.
No.
Okay.
I can be, if you'd like. I have the skill to do that.
I mean, I think sometimes a lot of my students probably would like me to be going under hypnosis sometimes.
Yeah.
Just so then I can remain quiet for a bit,
But try to look at language. Can you imagine a point where if we live long enough, if human species is around long enough, language becomes obsolete? We evolve into different forms of communication. Is that a possibility you can conceive of?
I think we already have a case here.
Yeah, right? Right?
Yeah, but still, compared to language, right? Language, you focus on the limitations, but language is basically unlimited. It takes some words and takes some effort, but you can put almost all thoughts into language. Well, in the sensor is really nice, but it's a seismic, like a single seismic event, or it has an amplitude. So it's not very many different messages you can give. The gut communicates with my brain, mostly by releasing hormones, which make me feel hungry or so. It's nice that it does so, because I know when to eat. But compared to language, it's a completely different class. So language, I can say all these things, you can understand what I'm saying.
But and I can also, I read you, as you saw earlier tonight.
That's true.
I read a body, I read a wave. So when I'm communicating with another human being, and my pet rabbit, I'm communicating on a much broader level of communication.
Yeah, but these are almost older.
Language.
These are older things, right? The way you use for mind reading, or these other ways to read bodies, these are very ancient systems that are still there and trouble us, and that are
someone
nice
like Kurt Van Munsberg would say that language is actually a technology.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not the thing in itself that does the doing.
Exactly. It's not communication.
It's
not communication.
It's not communication. It
Right.
is one form of many communication systems, but language itself can be thought of as a technology, and therefore the poets and storytellers of the world help us escape the truisms that we get trapped in through the conventions of the societies that we live in. And people like yourself, being able to delve into different experiences of the world, the artists that can help us expand the communication of experience. And help us find new forms for it. I don't think it's an either or. Language is a fantastic tool, and I think we can make a lot better use of it when we are more inclusive and less maybe blinkered to what our prejudices and what our habits are.
I think you mentioned an interesting point there, inclusivity. Is that a real word, actually, if you're talking about language, inclusiveness, I think? I think looking at it as a magician, the interesting thing is not that, I agree with you. You can use language to express so many different things. But I also noticed that you can use it to indeed create a reality that isn't true, to frame something that someone else believes, although it's not so. For example, if I might, I use often a trick with misdirection. I specifically tell people what to do in this trick. I specifically use language so that they will look at my hand or somewhere else where I want them to look. And this type of framing, I think it's called in communication sciences, by framing it, I can use language in such a way so that information gets lost. That's an interesting idea, I think, because that's, if we're talking about politics, that's a tool that politicians use. They use language to make you look into particular directions so that you will miss other things.
And in Thought in the Act, which is by Erin Manning and Brian Masumi, there's a beautiful opening chapter which is actually about the Asperger spectrum way of seeing the world. And what she talks about is foregrounding, and that neurotypicals foreground objects in the world and human-based objects, whereas people with autism spectrum tend to foreground environment, so that humans don't stand out from the environment, and so that their language and the way that they try to see and express the world actually starts on a different premise than what they're calling the neurotypicals.
And I mean, and for me, it's the deficit of contemporary machine learning and AI and big data processes. Exactly what you're saying, you too, because the way that the algorithms are designed, they become operational in reducing the excess amount of information that's derived. So automatically it's attached to an objective, just like spoken language. There is an objective that's neutral until we attach meaning to it. And what we see with machine learning and data processes is this extrasensory language that is actually being absorbed by the machine is treated as error. It's treated as noise, it's treated as nonsense. Yeah. And there's an actual systematic process to reduce that noise down to something that's a more universal attachment to the objectives that we have. And the interesting thing about it is when we look at, especially something like a generative neural network, the things, we're almost living in these two different spaces. So one, we have a desire to reduce that language down to something we can understand, but then at the same time, we're fascinated when the machine comes up with its own extrasensory type of languages. But we don't know what to do with those because we have in ourselves attached meaning to them. And I think it's sort of a shame that our focus now is on attaching meaning as opposed to letting it, basically setting it free and letting it express new types of relationships.
Would you...
Maybe, I mean, actually, we might open the, the sphere, and actually the thinking sphere to our audience here. Do we have any question from the audience on the dangerous thought and the production of these thoughts and how they are being made? Anyone here? Where are our amazing question courtier? Here, Joseph, come here. Hello, Joseph. Round of applause for Joseph, please. He survived this first year at the University of the Underground, and he, yes, please go ahead. Are you actually asking a question?
No, I'm just passing the mics around to take a roaming one. Oh, okay.
The mic.
Am I going to go and attack people now?
Yes, go and find some thinking machine cybernetic transspecies around here. Did we already kill all of your thought process? Are you already all dreaming, sleeping, in sleeping mode? Ah, it doesn't work. Well, that's that. You cannot speak then, I guess.
Okay, come.
Deprived from speech here is my doppelganger. Unfortunately, sometimes it's better that she doesn't speak, actually. But,
What? Hello? Yeah, it does.
okay.
Should we keep going?
No, I mean, we always,
Be sterling, everyone. Thank you.
Whether it's Joseph or Ada or someone else will ask you a question, that's not a problem.
Okay, I have a language question. Do you think it's dangerous that you're all speaking English in Amsterdam?
It's essential for me.
What's the demographics of the audience?
Speak in your microphone, please.
What is the demographics of this audience? Well, that would be an interesting question. Because I think that what we're attempting to do is address the audience.
And I would also say that our gut microbiomes are probably more integrated in terms of their linguistics than the oral languages that we're currently using as humans.
But I think for me, that's exactly my point when I'm saying that language exists prior to actually our engagement with language, is that this event was pre-prescribed as an English event prior to even our participation in it, which means that it already, before we even speak in the mic, it's already attached to power relationships. And so to pretend like that's just a functional process of word to word is actually sort of nonsense, right? It's actually attached to different mechanisms. And it's even more reductive because if we're going to have a collective event, in a language, we actually choose the language with the least amount of expression, which is English.
Whoa.
So,
I found this.
So already there's a reduction in understanding. Already there's a reduction in the universality of how that goes. I mean, if you look at the nuances of even spoken language that's there, the only reason we are actually speaking language in this room is because it has been pre-subscribed as the universal language in which most people can understand.
No, let me ask a question.
Thanks, Derek.
This is something I've given a lot of consideration to. Do you think language and the development of language has acted, in, maybe not intentionally, but has acted to suppress other forms of communication that humans are capable of?
Of course. I mean, if we look at actually the development...
So it's a limiting...
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the development of the modern world and any form of communication that we call language, it has nothing but a reductive effect. Yeah. I mean, the process of colonialism was not just force, it was language. The process of industrial revolution was not just time and labor, it was language. And each time a universal language.
Even bigger, even
absolutely.
Deeper than that.
Absolutely, because I think the thing that we fantasize about is sort of return to our sensory type of mode is part of the crises of us recognizing that language is far more. It's far more expansive and situational than just being prescribed within a certain amount of characters that are attached to a standard.
So talking about situation, I think we have here someone that is actually reacting directly to the earth. So part of it's true. You're only, you don't just react to the earth, but you're obviously vibrating with the earth.
Yes.
Yes, correct. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Does that change your power dynamics, you think, the fact that you're actually communicating with the earth as opposed to communicating with human being? I mean, I guess right now you are communicating with us, but...
It's not like... I don't think it's a communication. It's just like maybe the earth is communicating with me, I guess. It changed the perception of reality on earth. Like, it's very different to know that the earth is moving than actually to feel it constantly. So I think depending on how we communicate to each other, it changes our perception of everything, of how we are.
Can I ask you, how does it feel? I mean, can you describe the type of sensations that you're getting and where you're feeling them?
It's a vibration. It's just something that vibrates inside the food. So mechanically, it's very simple. Like before, I think it's what it means. It's just something that vibrates. But how I interpret these vibrations, for me now, it means that the earth is moving. So I guess also with language this happens. Like we all have our own interpretation, and then this is how we relate. Like that's why I find it exciting that very exciting that everyone can decide how they want to perceive. So I just want to make a point that we are all free to decide how we want to perceive reality and what senses do we want to have, and also how we want to interpret this and how we want to interpret these words and maybe create new channels and new ways of doing it.
So what language would you use to help us understand that unique communication that you're talking about?
I use art to share my experience. So I feel, so I see this cyborg art, but it's an artwork that happens inside the body. So I guess like I'm in the audience of my own art, because it's the seismic sense happens inside the artist. But in order to share what I feel, then I do dance performance, or I do also percussion. So it's my way to share. So my language is not based on words. It's just in movement and sound.
Any more questions from the audience before we, I mean, we can keep on talking for hours. Yes? Yeah. Can we have a...
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm amazed that all of you assume that language is a human thing. We used to think animals...
Can you repeat the start? Sorry.
Yeah. It seems all of you agree that language is a human thing. But now we know that animals have emotions, have some form of consciousness. They have communications, they have dialogues. We know fish, whales, they communicate. For me, language is not typically human. Also, on the other end of the spectrum, we have to understand computers also communicate. Yes?
I mean, for me, that assumption was never just human.
I didn't see
I actually have the opposite.
I definitely
Alexander here spent his life with rats.
Yeah. No,
right? We have quite a fair amount in the basement as well.
There's clearly communication on all levels, but the language that we use, that we can assign concepts to words, that we can make up new words and put experiences, match experiences to that word, and then transmit information that way. We don't know of any other animal at the moment that does it. Whales, we have no clue what they transmit. So it could be, I have no clue. But at least the mice so far, what we see, and most of the other animals, they don't seem to have make these new concepts, don't come anything close to language. Of course, language is on a scale from communication, very, very simple, one bit communication, to something very complicated, and most animals are somewhere in between. But language is really on one end of the spectrum and very special.
I would say that we haven't decoded how whales interact with each other, rather than they're just babbling nonsense and kind of respond to that in some kind of unintellectual way. I think they're obviously, particularly with bonding between mother and baby whales, I mean, they're obviously very complex.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure that they don't have conversations like we have now.
I know, but that's such an anthropocentric view that says that language only exists if human sentient beings understand what's happening.
Yeah.
And I don't see a relationship with this planet or our ethos or even our environment with centering any form of communication that can only be derived from one being on the planet.
And I guess in that
no, there's plenty of things that humans have done and made that other animals haven't done, right? So
but that's a performance. That's a performance element that you've ranked prior to coming
we
here.
We have one last question here,
and the limits
one
of language.
Last question there, and then we will move to. Okay, one last here, there. Ah, no, oh, you got speech deprived. Speech deprived. No. Always give the microphone to a woman, Joseph. I thought I taught you that very well this year. Always.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, because maybe I didn't think my question was so relevant. When I listen to you all, I have the sensation that we only talk about speaking language, and apart from you talk about body language, art language.
Well, she doesn't speak at all here.
No,
she never speaks. She doesn't say much.
Well, maybe she should. And also, I have the sensation that it's all very black and white. We talk about language, like speaking language, and that how much we've given importance to speaking language, and we forgot other type of language. But it doesn't mean that we cannot learn the other type of language again and pay attention to it and just make a balance between all type of language and get to understand each other in another way. I mean,
I'm not sure what made you think this way, because I mean, right now in this room you have like one magician, one hypnotherapist, one architect, one researcher, one neurobiologist, one transpecies. They are all speaking different languages.
No, I think the point is the nuance here is I really respect actually the interpretation. I think that means that maybe we failed in a sense of communicating our views in this, but I thought this conversation was actually thinking beyond spoken language and going back to it. We're weaving in and out, but the fact that you haven't had that impression is itself speaks to the limitation of language. But
I think we also haven't defined language here either. I think we're all talking about language coming from slightly different angles. But I would say that I think the job of the 21st century is to diversify the kinds of language, what we consider language and how we experiment and explore.
But you will be able to meet with all of them in the room afterwards and actually engage with them in workshops, conversation, and hypnotherapy as well. So you will be able to interact with them on a different mode in a bit. How about we have your last question over here? Yes. Okay, we take you as well. Yes.
Thank you.
Here you go.
I think there's one nuance here also that could be untangled. And even if there was no assumption being made in the middle of this room that language or communication is a purely human thing, I wonder how many of you actually think that communication requires intent, that it is somewhat intentional. Because when we look at, say, a cybernetic understanding of communication, this doesn't really require intent. It just requires a protocol that a certain network functions within. But then when some of you say, for instance, I'm not sure if what I deal is communication, then I sense that there is a certain presupposition that in order to deal with communication, I require intent. I wonder how many of you think that it is necessary for communication.
First I'd have to clarify, because cybernetics, the first and second wave, was all about intent. So there's a difference between the cybernetics and actual machine in computational reason. For me, computational reason is entering into a new space that actually is not dependent upon our sentient relationship with it. So
perhaps, Ramon, you can teach a class at the University of the Underground next year. Maybe. And you can all join on the difference between cybernetics and language intent. But keep going. Keep going.
I'm good.
How about you tell us about, actually, I think the answer to that question is very much in your gut, no?
It's all good.
Not all good. In your guts.
Oh, in my gut.
You see, typically,
yeah. Sorry,
language, but this is all good. Yeah, this is all good.
I was feeling you, Nelly.
Yes.
Well, I do think that there are molecular languages that are really going to open up our understanding, let's say, increase our relationship with nature, have a better relationship with nature. We're not there yet, but we've got people like Bonnie Basler, who's looking at microbial languages. And they're really cool and really diverse. So I think there's a hell of a lot of language that we need to stay open to and pay attention to.
And that perhaps have no intent because they come from bacteria?
I think it's very telling that the language associated with the experience of gut is quite limited, even though it's centered around the nose and the mouth, the palate. Once you kind of get round to the tummy, it's all a bit gurgly. And right down the other end, we don't really have those kinds of exquisite languages that we would associate with the experiences around the head, for example. So I think I think the awareness, and it's what I was trying to get to with your experience. It's the somatic knowledge, the sensory information that was driven out through the Enlightenment when Descartes privileges the rational mind over the fickle senses, and therefore we are to ignore sensory information and prioritize these things. And so, the language of poets and, kind of artists become second-rate forms of expression, and I kind of want to see that come back. Not back as a second form of expression. As a poetics and artistic forms of expression being recognized as languages equal to the rational languages.
Well, so perhaps this is actually the best line that will allow me to move to the next phase, where We are going to take a break until we take on our second conversation, which will be much more about politics of the nightlife and dreaming at night. And between now and then, I will recommend you to actually go and experience free flow language by learning how to make Coca-Cola out of Coke outside, but also learning how to make Monster with Rachel, learning how to be a Blue Gorilla upstairs, and learning how to move your mouse with Natalie Fifth, which is all happening outside. And with no more ado, we are going to boost a bit of sound music here. I thought that was going to be Alexander Cromer and Tom Burke here performing, but this is still Luke and Francisco. Go ahead, put us some good tunes, guys. This is happening. Yes, that's it.